All right. I think we ended off at some sniffing part. I have to find the part where it sniffs auto fit page trim. I forgot. I don't know. Wait, speak text search. I know. Let's cut. There you go. Oh, how do I remove this? Okay. um, remove this. Start here. We have how many pages? 17 and 19, 20, 21. And oh, only 5 pages or so. This allows us to make better set. Let's see what voice. Okay, it's good. Make sure everything's working. All right, there you go. Not too much vocal fry. Focuses on a hierarchy of pleasures. The view offered here simply focuses on differences in the kinds of capacities different beings have. This allows us to make better sense of the distinctiveness of humans and non human animals' lives in terms of their distinctive experiences, too. For instance, because persons possess rational agency, you can wrong them by limiting their freedom in significant ways. As Kohoran has argued, it might not be possible to wrong some non persons in quite so similar ways, but it is certainly possible to wrong them in ways that are also unique to them. For instance, we wrong birds when we install windows that reflect the sky on buildings, since they injure themselves often fatally by flying into them. Similarly, preventing dogs from having sufficient time to smell or sniff outdoors wrongs a dog by limiting and obstructing their pursuit of what they value because they gain considerable fulfillment from exercising their olfactory capacities. Neither of these are harms that humans experience, but both can be explained with references to the impact on a being's sentience. This is, as we have seen, because sentientism can explain the diversity of value laden experiences without requiring us to carry additional conceptual baggage. Moreover, adopting sentientism will in fact yield advantages over pluralism by interpreting the significance of the additional capacities that different beings possess in terms of the capacity for sentience rather than comparing separate kind of value. We avoid theoretical difficulties. To see this, imagine you must decide whether to harm a human or to harm a dog. The plurist might hold that both beings have sentience, but what the human has a different kind of moral status to the dog, because they also possess agency. It follows on pluralism that harming the human is somehow different and normally graver kind of wrong. This has implausible implications though. What is particularly relevant here is that it raises an incommensurability worry. How do you decide whether to harm one being or the other if the two beings have distinct kinds of moral status? In the human case, a pluralist will argue that there are additional and independent wrongs to the capacities with sentience, an interest of humans that are associated with agency, as well as those associated with sentience. For instance, it might be independently wrong to violate another human's will. In the dog's case, it is only those capacities slash interest associated with sentience that are the bias of the wrong. So the human is wronged in ways that cannot be explained in terms of anything the dog has in common. The solution might be to compare what the being do have in common, sentience, However, this reinvites the argument above concerning the redundancy of pluralism. On Sentientism, the solution is explanatory neat. We focus only on the comparative damage to what individuals value with their sentience. In the human case, capacities, interests associated with agency might be explanatorily important to account for wronging, but their importance can be explained in terms of human agency, or capacity for sentience, just like the dogs. Accordingly, if we must decide whether to harm a human or to harm a dog, we assess how to act by making evaluations over the effect that two different harms to the dog and to the human will have on what each being experiences in their sentience. As such, we might harm the dog and not the human, specifically because the human will experience a greater harm to what they value. The unique, enduring social shame of being subjected to the will of another. However, this comparative explanation only worked because there's two moral patients having something in common, their capacity for sentience. Sentientism therefore explains wrongs in a way that avoids unnecessary complexities. It follows on Sentientism that focusing specifically on human agents as the primary subject of research, social policy, and ethical theories is unjustified. Doing so may be permissible where intervention, research, and moral issues specifically concern human capacities, yet in vast majority of cases, this does not seem to be true. Non-humans are relevant for nearly all such conceivable issues. Insofar as they possess sentience, non-human animals should be considered in the same context humans are. Finally, there are also positive implications for those humans who lack cognitive abilities or capacities that ordinarily distinguish persons from non-persons. Humans lacking agency represent a challenge for philosophers endorsing an agency-based pluralistic model. It appears unintuitive to exclude individuals with profound cognitive disabilities from the category of persons, but if personhood is based on possession of distinct capacities, then it also seems inconsistent to include them. While the moral status of those with cognitive disabilities is certainly not denied on pluralism, a sentience-based monistic approach is far more intuitive on this front, since saintism will only implement a soft distinction between persons and non-persons. The inclusion worry does not have the same, if any, force. Humans lacking agency have the same kind of moral status as other humans and all moral patients. For that matter, on a monistic approach, we can make sense of the duties we have to those with disabilities by focusing on the extent and kind of capacities they have and the derivative value of those capacities to the bearers of them. 5.2 Comparing interest. The second motivation behind pluralism is that it avoids the counterintuitive implication that purportedly follows from sentientism. For instance, if choosing to benefit a human or animal, many hold that intuition that we ought to favor the human over the animal, and it would be wrong to do otherwise. However, sentientism might appear committed to claiming that we ought to flip a coin. To overcome this worry, we need to make comparisons not simply by equalizing, but by letting the interests, what moral patients experience as valuable, speak for themselves. Making comparisons in this way does not commit us to the counterintuitive implication that we ought to treat all sentient beings equally in moral conflicts. This is because some moral patients will face greater relative disadvantage than others, and so those moral patients ought to be favored. Before explaining this idea further, some clarification is needed. It might be thought that sentientism will only be successful in answering moral conflicts if we adopt hierarchical view, according to which different degrees of moral status correlate with the relative weight of different interests. However, scientism needs not rely on the idea that there are degrees of moral status, because there is a step between the claim that some interest weight varies in degree and the claim that this merits a variation in moral status. Instead of relying on absolute hierarchical metric of whose interests take priority over others in all cases, we can make comparisons against a common standard that holds relative to the being in question. One plausible common but relative standard for all sentient beings is achieving a life that is of value to being who life it is. On this common standard, what it means to lead a life that is of value depends on the being in question. So this will not require us to rank interest according to a hierarchy of moral status. However, this still permits comparisons between that common standard. We make relative comparisons of this sort on a daily basis. For instance, if we say that Pad the dog is a hungrier than B the human, we are making a comparison about their perceived relative hunger. Extending these comparisons to lives as a whole, we can argue that B. Keegan attempts to defend a view of this sort. See Borzer Avan for critiques concerning ranking, double counting, weighing negative value of interest, blah, blah, blah. For a good critical summary of the hierarchical view, according to this, a McMahon attempts something of this sort with a time relative interest account. For a good summary. Extend these comparisons to lives as a whole. We can argue that B's life is going to be better than Pad's if Pad faces less relative disadvantage than Pad in achieving or has already achieved what she deemed to have to be a life that is valuable. This allows the variation might occur in both how much or what kind of things different beings value, but it does not make the further claim that this generates wholesale differences in moral status. It follows that we can resolve conflicts without counterintuitive implications. We might benefit Pad over beer or B if it is true that Pad faces greater relative disadvantage in achieving what he values than P or B or wherever. Nonetheless, in other contexts, we might favor B if and because she faces greater relative disadvantage in achieving what she values. To be sure, such decisions will be challenging in rescue cases. It may be that we regularly save humans in such cases because humans possess a greater range of interests that take into account. A second. It may be if it because nonetheless in other contexts we might favor B if and because she faces greater relative disadvantage in achieving what she values. To be sure, such decisions will be challenging in rescue cases. It may be that she regularly saves humans in such cases because humans possess a greater range of interest to take into consideration than other animals. Yet this need not follow in all cases. Imagine, for instance, that a human has already led a long and happy life, and the dog is still a puppy. Furthermore, it may be that some contexts the human and the dog face an equal relative disadvantage. Give me a second more. Okay. Yeah, this need not follow in all cases. Imagine, for instance, that a human has already led a long and happy life, and a dog is still a puppy. Furthermore, it may be that in some contexts, the human and the dog face an equal relative disadvantage in achieving what they value, but this would not be an overly counterintuitive moral conflict. All theories face moral conflict, but scientism will have the resources to address such conflicts by focusing on what each being experiences as valuable. Notice that this once again makes Satanism explanatorily neat. It focuses only on relative comparisons of interest without plurality of moral statuses. On Satanism, it follows that moral patients traditionally thought to be moral marginal ought to have greater priority in our consideration than tend to be thought by pluralists. This will have revisionary implications. Briefly, consider how scientism will affect individuals, trade off, and distributions. When considering individual cases, we will often be required to favor non human animals over humans. For instance, imagine you have a choice to adopt a dog or child. To make an assessment, you should compare the interest alone. This will mean that you ought to favor the child in numerous cases where the child faces greater relative disadvantage in achieving what they value, but you ought to favor the dog if the dog is instead in greater need. If the child is well looked after and the dog is lacking sufficient care, this does not seem counterintuitive. Quite the opposite. Additionally, rather than allocating most resources to humans, we will be required to contribute more greatly to the schemes supporting non-human. For instance, we ought to derive our divert resources to setting up uh, schemes. What is first time? I'm right, but a large scale systematic plan of arrangement, attaining object of okay, setting up schemes promoting animal welfare, including research, education, health services, even at a relative cost to the services that benefit humans. Similarly, environmental and urban policy choices ought to reflect a commitment to further the interest of all humans and non-humans. Urban spaces ought to be designed with non-human interests in mind. Land ought to be dedicated to rewilding initiatives in non-human interests. Cultural practices that are incompatible with the promotion of non-human welfare, such as hunting, ought to be banned. Even philosophers ought to be awarded non-human greater time and attention in their theories. All these policies ought to be pursued, even if at a relative cost to human interest. These implications are not exhaustive. Instead, they are intended to demonstrate that Satanism result in revisionary but not counterintuitive implications. Inclusion. This article argues that sentience should be the only basis of moral status. Not only is a sentience-based monism more conceptually parsimonious than pluralism, but it seems to have far greater explanatory power, making pluralism redundant. The upshot is that in determining which being can be wronged and how, we should pay attention to only one capacity, sentience. This has at least two implications. The first is that the distinction between persons and non persons cannot hold. All moral patients should feature as primary subjects in ethical theories, public policies, and research agendas, including non human animals. It is not enough to focus primarily on persons as subjects of moral concern. Scientism demands that we do not simply admit that other moral patients are morally considerable, but that we include them in many of the same kind of considerations that we already include humans, and wherever their interests are morally relevant. The second is that even though scientism will not result in counterintuitive implications, it will result in revisionary ones. We ought to prioritize non-human interests far more often than we tend to. The author has no relevant financial or non-financial influence conflict to discuss about. Jesus Christ, how much stuff did they read to make this article? I wish I read this much. I should look into some of this. Capacities in a just society. Whoa, whoa, that's a lot. Um, since I'm here, I might as well read the mock-up too. Hmm, I'm trying to find it. Doubt I'm gonna find it. Is it this? Nope. Where are you? Maybe I'll type it in. Okay, I found it. Downloading process taking a while. All right, then I'll just have to put it through this. To Oklar. Cut the screen for a second. Okay, there you go. Am I on the right one? Okay, this is just some. I asked it to give me all the definitions for the words, just in case I don't. So I don't. I don't like reading through stuff and not understanding. And I don't. Okay, I don't poop on GPT. Okay, it's useful, especially these research questions where it can ask it to explain the article, the words in an article, maybe the things I missed. I'll read through the first 5 to 10 pages. Okay. Matthew W. Perry argues that Sentientism. I don't know if I'm pronouncing this right. Let me just search it up. I need to use. I need to use um pronounce. No one's no way someone is that pronounce. Sentientism. 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 I'll be back. Okay, I'm back. I just need to read 2 pages because I need to go to my bed because I have work. Stuff like that. Boom. Okay. When I lay on my side, Jesus, my gosh, the acid is crazy. The other last one. Anyways, Matthew W. Perry argues Satanism the view that capacities for sentience. Let me just do this. I can read this another time. I got other things to do, buddy. I mean, I could make this. No. I don't have to read this another time. Yeah, I should, and cut this right there. And I'll start up another stream where I can just